Alrighty, everybody, it is currently Thursday, September 11th, 2025, and I'm coming at you live from Building 7 of the World Trade Center. I don't know if you guys heard the news, but the North and South Tower, the two twin towers, just got hit, but there's no way our building's gonna fall, right? There's no, scientific, reasonable explanation as to why our building would fall, aside from it being some sort of inside job where thermite or some other, explosive or steel melting chemical was placed on the beams of our building. So I think I'm good. I think I'm good and safe in this building. And that was a joke. It was a 9/11 joke, more so a 9/11 conspiracy joke. But it is funny that this episode has just so happened to fall on 9/11, also kind of falling the day after an event some people were saying was going to cause a civil war. It's not, guys. I hate to break it to look, I want the apocalypse too. All right. I want to, go out, say fuck college, fucking 9 to 5, and just slaughter towns of people all day, for minor political differences. That is what I want to do. Right. And I know the vast majority of other, young men in this country, they also want to do that same thing. I know it's what we all want to do, dude. We all want to, kill all the men and then force the women and children into one building and then pour a bunch of gasoline on that building and light it up, man. It's what we all want to do, all right? Guys just want to have fun. And really, if you look at history, that's the way guys have had fun for most of history, all right? Most of history has just been dudes killing all the men and then burning all the women and children alive for some reason. I don't know why that's the setup. I guess you got to kill the dudes first to get the threat out of the way, and then you light the building on fire. But whatever, that's how guys have fun, and although our society has progressed, it hasn't progressed that much that, burning a building full of innocent people isn't still fun. All right, just ask George Bush. George Bush burned several buildings full of innocent people, and he seems as happy as a clam. I'm talking about George W. here, although I'm sure his father, George H.W. Bush, who was, I think, the head of the CIA, maybe not the head, but high up in the CIA, I'm sure he is also directly responsible for the incineration of a few ethnic minorities in a country you've never heard of. But and it's fun to do. All right, guys love doing shit like that, and that's the thing that feminism has taken away from us. feminism feminism has taken, the most ancient, masculine form of entertainment away from us, and I won't stand for it. All right, I will not stand for it. But yeah, this episode's coming out on 9/11, and we're going to talk about some of the boys who were allegedly involved with that. I don't know. I don't know if you guys believe, that hoopla, that story that's been told to you. I don't. I clearly don't believe it. So we're going to be talking about those guys. And then, if by some miracle the Civil War does pop off and you're like, how can I get to burning villages as quickly as possible? I'm going to break that down for you real quick because I know that's what you guys want to get up to. You don't want to be a diplomat, or you don't want to be, negotiating a peace deal or a ceasefire or anything like that. You want to be in, some sort of refugee camp with a container of napalm in a fucking big lighter with a pickle on it. That's that's where you want to be. All right. And I don't blame you at all for it. All right. Like I said, that's just how guys have had fun. And guys having fun doing that, at least we're honest about it. At least we're honest, saying, I like burning down a building full of innocent people. At least we're transparent about that fact. But the women are so facetious about it because they don't even call the innocent people they murder people, Kind of the same thing as Israel. Is Israel just like a woman? Kind of, if you think about it. If you think about it, Israel really is just, a woman. They lie constantly about everything they do. And then as soon as you get upset at them for doing the thing that they've been doing, they, turn it around on you and act all, defenseless and, turn you into the bad guy. So, I don't know. Maybe I've made that point before. I've talked about Israel so much I forget everything that I've said. But Israel is like a woman, all right? It's, I mean, they'll just do something undeniably awful. Something that's so bad that every culture on earth throughout the history of the world has agreed that that's a bad thing to do. And then when you go, "Hey, that was kind of a bad thing you did," they'll be like, "So you hate me? Eh? So you're an anti-Semite? So you're a sexist, misogynist, male incel pig?" Yeah, and that's what if any woman ever listens to this, which I doubt will happen, I doubt anyone will ever listen to this, but if any woman ever listens to this, that will be the response, and it wouldn't be the most unfair response. It would be pretty close to the truth, not far off. You know what I mean? You're not hitting the bullseye. It's like when that guy killed Charlie Kirk yesterday, but for you guys, it's been almost a week since Charlie Kirk got killed, so everyone's probably forgot about it and no one's talking about it anymore. Um, but if a woman were to call me an incel, misogynist, sexist pig, it wouldn't be, the JFK headshot pink mist type situation. It would be more of a Charlie Kirk situation where they hit you in the neck. Turns out it was the carotid artery. I kept saying jugular vein. It was the carotid artery that he got hit in, where it's like, it's not a headshot, but you still got the kill. All right. So calling me a, chauvinist, misogynistic, patriarchal pig, you're not getting the headshot, but you're still getting the kill. So that's something to be proud of there, at least. something to be, something to hang your hat on. And you don't need the headshot. People over that the headshot's way overhyped. If you get the kill, a kill's a kill. Okay, so yeah, I don't know, but no woman will ever listen to this. Women have no interest in learning anything that's even remotely of value. And I'm not saying, anything that I'm talking about is that valuable. Like last week, I talked about a book written by a schizophrenic dude for an hour. that's that's not really of that much value. And even the way, I explain it, even if what I'm talking about is of value, the way I explain it is so poorly done that it becomes no longer valuable. It's kind of like inflation. This is like knowledge inflation, where it's like there at some point in the process was some value to the things I'm talking about, but the way I talk about it makes it no longer valuable. So, yeah, and but women, they're not even gonna click on a video about guerrilla warfare, Singapore, or whatever. And if they do, I mean, that's, I don't know. I'm gonna track you down and like smell your hair and like steal some of your clothes and stuff like that, because you are the perfect woman. But the perfect woman is just me, but in a hot woman's body, because I clearly am a perfect person. Whatever. Who gives a shit, man? Who cares about anything? But hey, who cares about anything? That is kind of a good start to a guerrilla war. That's how you really get people going. For this episode, we're gonna break down a couple very successful guerrilla wars that have been fought. And people, I don't really like the internet, like military people. Like I said, I watch a lot of videos about that stuff, but the people who talk about it, it's just very annoying. It's fake hardo shit. Like some dude who was a fucking beat cop in fucking Arvindale, Ohio, or whatever for 2 years, is like breaking down footage of Navy SEALs. It's like, fuck, suck my dick. I don't. You, you know less about this than I do, and I'm a moron, so you're a dum dum. But so I don't really like the internet, like hardo military guys. They all have like these guns and these night vision goggles, and they're like, if the fucking American government impedes on my rights, I'm gonna kill them. And then they come out and they defend like the guy who shot Breonna Taylor while she was sleeping in her bed, right? Like that's the Blue Lives Matter people are also very anti-government. It's an odd group of people. It's a very unusual group of people that I don't like at all. And I've talked about this before. One of the most annoying groups of people, but I feel like when I talked about the Blue Lives Matter people, I didn't expound as much upon their, you know, proclaimed libertarianism, but in actuality they're not libertarians. They just hate minorities. I guess. And it's not always ethnic minorities, or racial minorities. Sometimes, it's gay people or trans people or women, but I guess women aren't a minority. I don't know why we treat women like a minority. Like women, everyone talks about like the oppression of women, and the women are getting all their rights taken away, and it's like, get a gun. Like, we made these things called guns. It's not 1000 AD anymore. You know what I mean? You don't have to fight with a battle axe and a club or whatever. Physical strength does not play the role that it used to. Get a gun. Get a goddamn gun. Um, but yeah, start your own guerrilla warfare force, and I'm gonna teach you how to do it. I'm gonna, not really. I'm just gonna mostly talk about these guerrilla forces, but you can glean a lot of information from them, and ultimately, the reason a lot of guerrilla forces are successful, it's not as like violent as you might think, and a lot of these guerrilla forces aren't overtly militarily successful, if that makes sense. Like the Viet Cong, everyone's like, oh, the Viet Cong fucking destroyed the United States and kicked them out of the country. I will die on this hill, by the way. I do not think America should have been in Vietnam, but we did win that war. You know, People are like, oh, the Viet Cong made America leave. And it's like, that's not, the war wasn't about killing all the Viet Cong or, the communists, like guerrilla militant forces in northern Vietnam. It wasn't about that. It was about stopping the spread of socialism and communism to Vietnam and just Southeast Asia as a whole. And people will be like, oh, well, Vietnam, they're still a socialist country. No, they're not. Vietnam is not anywhere. They don't, their government isn't powerful or cohesive enough to be a socialist government. All right. So we did win that war. And we also, everyone talks about how good the Viet Cong were and how effective the guerrilla force was. Dude, a million communist militants were killed in Vietnam. And probably at least a fifth of those communist militants were 8-year-olds in villages. So we'll bump that number down to 800,000 just to keep it fair. And then America lost like 50,000 soldiers. We whooped on them, guys, and we stopped the, spread of socialism and communism to Vietnam. It's the old thing people say where it's like there's a McDonald's in Ho Chi Minh Square. All right, we got you. It's fine to admit that the most powerful military in the world was able to successfully suppress an uprising of farmers. That's fine to say. I don't get why it's such a big deal. No, I do. I do get why people, want to say America lost the Vietnam War because we shouldn't have been there in the first place, which I do agree with that fact. It's very stupid that we were there, and I'm sure the actual reason we were there wasn't because of communism or whatever. I'm sure it was so we could get like black tar heroin out of Cambodia or whatever, or the military industrial complex. That's the classic one, but the military industrial complex kind of applies to every single war America's been involved in after World War II and even kind of during World War II. But so that's kind of a blanket, that's the underlying one, that's the asterisk on every single war since World War II. But we're not here to talk about World War II or whatever. We're here to talk about guerrilla warfare. This one's called How to Win a Guerrilla War. I don't know if that's I don't know if I hold that much information and valuable knowledge. I know I don't. I know I don't hold that much information or valuable knowledge, but it's a little bit of insight, into what made some of the most effective guerrilla warfare uh, forces good at what they were doing. So the first one we're going to talk about is the July 26th movement. And you might be thinking from hearing this, which is maybe I'm just saying that because this is what I thought, but when I heard about this, I thought it was like an insurrection type shit. I thought it was like in a like if January 6th actually went well and wasn't just like an inside job from the FBI. Like that's what I thought the July 26th movement was. And so I was like, and this is kind of I'm not interested in that. I'm more interested in like long-term, a couple years type of warfare, not just like some quick coup or, insurgency or insurrection or whatever. I wanted some like long term shit that I could really learn from. But this was the name of the entire this entire guerrilla war that was fought in Cuba. This is like the Cuban Revolution, but the name Fidel Castro and all those boys gave to it was uh the July 26th movement, which is funny, and I'm going to talk about why that's funny. So, on July 26th, 1953, Fidel Castro attempted an assault on Moncada Military Barracks, on the Moncada Military Barracks. So this is this is a kind of another funny thing about this. Fidel wasn't even going for the capital or anything like that. He wasn't going for, the president's house or whatever, or not even like a super valuable military target. Barracks is just like, yeah, there's like weapons and stuff there, but that's kind of just where like they live. He basically he basically attacked a college dormitory, but instead of like alcoholics and whores being in the college dormitory, it was it was people who were interested in having a legal avenue to murder people. So very, very funny. He basically just attacked a college dorm with a few more guns than there is in the average college dorm. And yeah, this is Fidel. So, and Fidel ruled the country until like 2016, that's absurd. That's like some kind of European monarch or something like that. That's and he still called himself the president. After like 10 years of being the president, it's like just say you're the dictator. I don't know why he was still like, no, I'm the president. It's the same thing with Kim Jong Un. It's like, dude, just say you're the dictator. No one can do anything about it anyway, clearly. So just say you're the dictator. So yeah, 53, dude. That's a long ass fucking time ago. All right, so the attack was meant to spark an uprising against socialist dictator Fulgencio Batista. I'm just gonna call him Batista because that's what everyone calls him. And that's another funny thing about this whole revolution is I'll just like spoiler alert now. One of the main things that makes a guerrilla war very effective is having lots of support from like the general populace, right? Like the middle class, people like that, or I guess in the instance of Cuba and a lot of other revolutions that have happened throughout history, especially communist revolutions, the peasant class of people, the class of people that have no power and are like the most oppressed under the current regime. If you guys have their support, then you're going to be pretty successful. But so he got a lot of support from the Cuban peasants to overthrow this guy Batista, and they must have been like, "Fuck yeah, Fidel, he's doing it. He's overthrowing the leader. Let's get it." And then finally, spoiler alert again, Fidel rose to power. And they were like, "Fuck yeah, Fidel, are you gonna hold an election? Because that guy fucking Batista, he never did it." Fidel was just like, "Nah, I'm not. I'm not doing that either, dude. I'm not." And he was a lot more successful than this guy Batista. And I know Fidel Castro is one of those people that like modern socialists like idolize a whole bunch. So they're gonna be like, no, this guy Batista, he wasn't an actual socialist. He was a fascist, or he was like a neo-socialist. It's like, guys, he was a socialist. It's fine to say that. Like these are the same people that look up to like Stalin and like Mao Zedong and stuff like that. But they're scared to be like, this guy Batista wasn't a real socialist. I don't know. Same with like Hitler, right? Like Hitler was like the National Socialist Party. It was more fascism than it was socialism, but socialism and fascism are a lot closer than most people realize, right? Like a lot of these American socialists are like, we're anti-fascist or whatever, and it's like, you guys know you're like a step away from full-on fascism. You like ask them what they believe in, and they're like, high taxes, uh, the government kind of being involved in everything, and everyone uniting under the banner of socialism to work together. And it's like, dude, that's just like one step away from fascism. I hope you know that. I hope you know socialism and communism are basically a step away from fascism. uh, because they're both, and that's just because they're both like big government ideologies, specifically like centralized big government ideologies. So yeah, this was socialist on socialist crime, which that wasn't. This is like a rare instance of that. If you look at like the Cold War, the wars, the ideological wars between the West and communism that sprung up all over the place, uh, a lot of like barely any of those wars were socialists fighting against like powerful socialist regimes. A lot of them did end up having socialists fighting each other, but after they had overthrown, the Western capitalist imperialist regime. So yeah, just kind of, I don't know, interesting and funny that they were like, this guy, and it's very similar to the viewpoint that a lot of these modern socialists and communists have, where it's like, no, that guy was a brutal dictator who killed millions of people and put his country into financial ruin. But this new guy, he's actually going to change things. Like the Cubans went through that, going from Batista to Castro. So pretty funny. And we're going to talk about this attack. So the attack was a frontal assault, which is a tactic that involves no flanking or maneuvering, and that's a very bad idea when it comes to having your guerrilla force fight a larger force. You The tenets of guerrilla warfare are very close to the tenets of what is called maneuver warfare, which is what the US used for a long time, and it's what like Napoleon and guys like that used. And the US hasn't really fought any major wars in, the past 9 years. Maybe a little bit after that. I know we pulled out of Afghanistan in 2021, but we weren't fighting too heavily in Afghanistan for a while there. Uh, but maneuver warfare is very close to guerrilla warfare, and it's a very basic idea that Napoleon didn't come up with it, but he did kind of perfect it. And the biggest aspect of maneuver warfare that's kind of not as useful in guerrilla warfare is this thing called the violence of action. And the violence of action is basically fuck it, we ball. Right? It's you find a target of some kind and you dedicate a very large force of people, of supplies, of logistics, and all that stuff to attacking that target and just going full force into that. And that works for uh militaries like the US government and stuff like that, because it's like they they have like a pretty big fallback plan, and that fallback plan is they're the United States military, right? But if you're a guerrilla force, especially if you're like a splintered guerrilla force, uh which these guys weren't as splintered as the other group we're going to talk about here, but they were fairly splintered. You don't have that same fallback plan as a larger, more logistically stable military power like the United States government. So you still have some aspects of maneuver warfare, like just constantly maneuvering, and it's kind of stick and move type stuff, but more so setting up the attack as opposed to just lining up and just throwing bodies at each other, which is kind of more the old school way of doing things. But now people are saying maneuver warfare is outdated, and it's like those are the two options in war. The two options in war are stay in one place and then send a big charge, or outmaneuver your enemy. So I don't know. If maneuver warfare is outdated, then I guess we're going back to the old way of doing things. Um, so maneuver warfare is very close to guerrilla warfare, but the violence of action, it's you look at examples of it. Like I'll give you an example of it being used in guerrilla warfare. This is an example of it, but another kind of more famous example of it is the Tet Offensive, which happened in the Vietnam War. And if you've ever seen the movie Full Metal Jacket, that's when they're at the base and they're all like chilling together, and like the sirens start going off and there's explosions and stuff, and they all run to the trenches and start shooting. That was the Tet Offensive. And the Tet Offensive was the northern Vietnamese communist militant forces basically like snuck into southern Vietnam, which was where the US was stationed, and also southern Vietnam was fighting northern Vietnam at the time. That's kind of what the whole war was. I think a lot of people think it was like America versus just like everyone in Vietnam. No, it was we had a lot of support from the South Vietnamese, and 200,000 South Vietnamese died in that war. So, or 200,000 South Vietnamese forces. I'm sure many, many more died. But basically, the northern Vietnamese snuck into South Vietnam and like got around all these American military bases. And the Tet holiday is like it's the biggest holiday in Vietnam. I think Vietnam is a Buddhist country or majority Buddhist, and their particular sect of Buddhism has Tet, which I think is the New Year's, or maybe I don't remember. It's just some very big holiday that's basically like Christmas for them. So they didn't think, the American forces didn't think that the communist Vietnamese would attack them on Tet. And for a number of years before that, there had been like basically a ceasefire on Tet just to respect everybody. And obviously, like if the Americans were killing Vietnamese on Tet, they would have lost any support they did have in South Vietnam. So but these guys, the communist militants, were like, "Fuck it, we're gonna do it anyway," which that's a fine move. It It's war. I know some people might get upset by shit like that, but it's like, I don't know, man. People are getting slaughtered every day. It's just now they're just slaughtering them on Christmas or whatever. I don't, and I get it. I'm not like a super religious person, and I'm sure I don't fully understand the importance of a holiday like Tet, but still, I don't see what the big deal is. But this was an example of violence of action because they, the communist Vietnamese, went full force into this Tet holiday or Tet offensive, and they attacked a bunch of different American military bases at once, and it was a gigantic loss for them. It was a huge loss for them. Uh, so many people died and so many people were captured. They did get a little bit out of it. They captured a few embassies in Saigon and Hanoi, I believe, but it was a major loss from them. And that's an example of the violence of action just doesn't work with a guerrilla force because you don't have anything to fall back on. Especially the Tet offensive, they didn't have anything to fall back on because they were behind enemy lines. So that's why this attack on this base ultimately failed. It was an example of a guerrilla force trying to use the violence of action. And another big aspect of the violence of action is like demoralizing your enemy, right? Because you go full force into this just to like show them what the fuck is up. Um, and not every example of violence of action is a frontal assault, but this particular one was. So yeah, failed for him. So that's a big thing you're going to want to avoid if you're going into guerrilla warfare. You can't be doing the violence of action. You can adopt some aspects of maneuver warfare, but the violence of action is not, it's never a good thing. It's never a good thing to like be slaughtered by your enemies, even if you end up like capturing a lot of the objectives that you want to capture, just because that's a big hit to morale. So the violence of action for a traditional force, it's a boost to that side's morale because it's not going to be a major loss to their morale if the violence of action ends up not going their way, right? It's not, it's a big reward for a little bit less of a risk, whereas for a guerrilla force, it's an incredibly big risk, right? Like in this example, it almost lost them the entire war, and I'll explain why. So, but I'll talk a little bit more about a frontal assault. So, frontal assaults require a large or coordinated force of firing to mitigate the enemy's defenses, which, yeah, obviously these guys didn't have that. Obviously, they were in a fucking island in the Caribbean. They didn't have, artillery and mortars and all that good shit to be able to mitigate the defenses that existed at this barracks or at these barracks to capture them. And that's a big thing that you got to do if you're trying to perform a successful frontal assault. And you don't need like military and mortars and stuff like that, but you need a large amount of firepower. And a frontal assault doesn't mean you just run straight at the thing or whatever. You can just like sit there and shoot at them for a while, but you're not, outflanking anyone or anything. And if you're attacking a base, you're not going to like outflank the base. That's like the entire purpose of bases is you don't have any flanks that, people can kind of maneuver around. So yeah, this was just kind of a pretty big failure this for Fidel Castro and the communist Cuban forces. So many rebels were killed in the assault and Castro was imprisoned. So, and this is like the main thing that's like, this might be an example of like history is written by the victors where it's like this guy Batista is supposedly like this insanely brutal dictator, and I'm sure he wasn't great to the people of Cuba, but neither was Castro. And so it's like, and he didn't even kill Castro. I would have done that immediately. I would have been like, no, kill that guy, right? Yeah, no, fuck him. He's dead. Even if he wasn't like this powerful, influential, political and military leader that was against me, I'd still be like, no, he tried to attack a dorm room, basically. Kill him, right? Or like a dorm building. Just kill him. So I don't know. That's not like a dictator move. Dictators kill people for being like his hair looks kind of weird today, right? Like Kim Jong Un. If you say Kim Jong Un, you're like, is that guy losing hair? You're getting a bullet in the back of your fucking head. You're getting an even worse death than that. Kim Jong Un executes people. The boy's got creativity, right? Like his uncle. Kim Jong Un killed his uncle by tying him to a post in the middle of a field and then having artillery basically shoot around him and zero on his uncle's like exact position and blowing him up with a piece of artillery. You know, that's what happens in like severe dictators. And I don't know, maybe Batista was losing power. Obviously, Fidel Castro gained a ton of support among the populace, so maybe Cash or maybe Batista didn't have that much power at the time, but still, I don't know, not very dictatory of you to not kill your enemies. Um, so yeah, a lot of rebels got killed, and a lot of them got imprisoned as well. So Castro was released in 1955, and I don't know if Batista exiled him to Mexico or if he went to Mexico like kind of exiling himself, but he he went to Mexico. Either he was exiled there or it was kind of a, Charlie Brown hold your head down and just like walk out of there. I don't know which one it was, but he ended up in Mexico, you know what I mean? I'm sure he partied a little bit. I'm sure he took a trip down to Cancun because after being exiled to Mexico, he returned in a yacht, which is the pinnacle of socialism. The pinnacle of socialism is being like everyone needs to have the same amount of money. Rich people are all evil, and then you pull up in a yacht. That's the pinnacle. That's the pinnacle of socialism right there. And it is pretty funny. It is very funny to be like everyone needs to be equal, and we need to kill the bourgeoisie and all that stuff. And then you pull up in a motherfucking yacht, dude. Yeah, that's some pimp shit, dude. That is some pimp shit right there. And while he was in Mexico, he met a lot of other communist people. The main one being our boy Che Guevara, who I think he was actually like a pretty decent guy. Um, Fidel was not. Fidel was obviously not. Che seems like a little bit more of a chill dude, and Che is just a more chill name than Fidel. Like Fidel, when I say Fidel, I think of like infidel, right? Which is obviously linked to like radical Islam and all that stuff, right? But like Che is like Che. Yeah, Che. I almost have to do a surfer accent when I say Che. Che. And I'm doing the hang 10 thing right now with my hands. Che is a lot more chill of a name, and he met Che in Mexico before they pulled up on a yacht. And this is, you might be thinking like yacht, that might just mean a big boat. Maybe it does, but this particular yacht is, I could see Bezos riding around on the top of this thing. I could see Mark Zuckerberg, face painted white as hell, riding in the wake of this yacht on a hydrofoil. So this isn't this isn't just like a big boat. This isn't a fishing boat or whatever. He ain't Bubba Gump. This was a like luxury pleasure yacht. So he pulled up back to Cuba with that. So upon his return in 1956, most of the rebels were killed or captured, and the rest retreated into the Sierra Maestra Mountains, which I guess is a mountain range in Cuba. And he only had like 80 rebels with him, which is like, dude, not a good. It seems like every, invasion of Cuba like that, every like water to land invasion of Cuba is a complete failure. And I don't know how many there are. The only other example that I know of is the Bay of Pigs, which was also a complete and utter failure. So I guess if quick tip, if you're invading Cuba, don't do it by water onto land. I don't know what the other ways to do it is. I guess jump out of planes and stuff like that. But yeah, not a good idea to just pull up on the fucking dinghy. It's not a good idea to fucking water ski up to Cuba when you're trying to invade it. So, and that's how they pulled up. And yeah, like 60 of the rebels were like killed or captured. So they lost 6/8. What's that? I don't know. 6/8 is 3/4, so it's 75%. They lost like 75% of their force, and they only had 80 to begin with. And all the main guys did escape. Fidel, Che, there was this guy named Raul in there. They all escaped into the Sierra Maestra Mountains. So, Maestera, I don't know. Spanish is weird like that sometimes, but I guess I do speak English, so I'm not the one to talk about weird pronunciation. So, they go to the mountains, and in the mountains, Castro built a guerrilla base and gained support by promising land reform and an end to Batista's corruption and brutality. So this was, like I said, the big reason why this in most guerrilla warfare incidences have been so successful is because of mass support from the populace. And one way to do that is by bribing people, which is kind of what Fidel Castro did. I do understand the communist uh, sentiment of being like, the people who own the land gained it unduly, uh, and they didn't like earn it and like really work for it. I do understand that sentiment, but you're also bribing people by giving them free land, right? Like land is that's basically equal to money. It's not it's a very non-liquid asset, but still. He was basically given money. It would be like, "No, I'm not giving people money to vote for me. I'm giving them I'm giving them sports cars." Everyone knows sports cars aren't money. So, and he was doing this exclusively in the Sierra and Maestra Mountains, and that's where they did a lot of their operations throughout this whole July 26th movement. So the movement isn't referring to like one particular physical movement. It's talking about this failed, uh, not coup, but show of force or violence of action that they attempted to do on July 26, 1953, on the barracks. So, but yeah, to gain support, you can kind of do what you can do what Fidel did and just give people lots of land. And I don't know how much land he gave away, but even just like the promise of it, right? It's like, if you vote for me, I promise you'll get a sports car, which I guess that's how most politics works. So I don't want to talk too much shit about Fidel, right? Like most politicians are like, if you vote for me, you're gonna make a whole bunch more money at your job. You're gonna be able to buy a house and all that shit. So it's not too unusual, but it is a little bit more, you know, if people show up with guns and stuff and they're like, if you support me, I'll give you land, you're a little bit more inclined to believe that person as opposed to a person who's just like on a stage somewhere being like, if you vote for me, you'll get a bunch of money, right? It's the promise is a little bit more realistic coming from an armed guerrilla force as opposed to a dude in a suit and tie who's just standing on a stage. And obviously that wasn't the only reason why people supported Fidel. They were obviously sick and tired of Batista, but I'm sure it helped. I'm sure the promise of like basically free money helped. And that's why a lot of these communist insurgencies have been so successful, right? It's just because people are like, a lot of them do live in very shitty situations that aren't communist or socialist in the first place. And so this, ideology coming in that they don't really know that much about, being like, I promise you'll get all this good shit, that's like a big, big motivator for them. So, and then, so Castro used support from both wealthy and poor Cubans to fund and operate his force. So, not necessarily like super wealthy Cubans, you know what I mean? Not the bourgeoisie, not like the super upper class, but like middle class to like kind of higher class people. And that's where a lot of these dictators mess up. They don't get the oligarchs on their side as much as they should. They don't. There's no like real threat there to the oligarchs, and there's no like promise that you'll get all this money and shit and all this money and power if you try to keep me in power. That's kind of where I think Batista messed up a bit, because for someone to come in and say to you like, I'm going to take away a lot of your money and then give it to poor people, and I'm sure he didn't like say that, but that's kind of essentially what communism is. And once again, I'm not saying that's like the worst thing ever. I kind of agree with it in a lot of ways, but yeah, saying that to upper class people should create the response of being like, no, fuck off, I'm gonna do everything in my power to get you killed. But I guess this Batista guy was like so shitty that these people that did have a little bit of money were like, fuck it, dude. I would rather I would rather see those poor people get fed than get killed or whatever. And I'm sure it wasn't like that altruistic, but it was something along those lines. And so these more wealthy people, they didn't really do too much fighting. They did a lot to spread the ideology, and obviously, within colleges, college is kind of how you reach the youth of the like middle to upper class, right? And so I'm sure a lot of the influence he had on those wealthier Cubans kind of transferred over to the world of, higher education, which then got him a lot more support. So he was very good at that. That's one thing you have to give Castro. Once he got that power, he did not keep a goddamn promise, but in order to get that support to gain that power in the first place. Not a bad job by the boy Castro. Not an awful job. So, and then obviously, a lot of the poor people were the ones who did the actual work to, move the guns and the weapons and the people and the supplies uh, throughout the country for the force. So, but the middle class people did help with that as well, apparently. But I do imagine most of their assistance came through monetary means. So that's what's going on. And Castro and most other leaders stayed in the mountains while urban forces coordinated strikes, protests, and sabotage. And this is uh, a very important thing when it comes to guerrilla warfare. Is you got to stay where you can hide. If you're in, I don't think Cuba has many big cities outside of Havana, so it's like there's not a lot of places to hide there. And even if there is, let's say you run into a building or whatever, that building gets surrounded, you're fucked. Whereas the woods, especially if you know them super well, in these mountains, the mountains seem to be like the main thing that these guerrilla forces have at their advantage. Right? Like the other instance we're going to talk about is Afghanistan, and they used the mountains to their advantage there. That's the main reason it was so hard for us to fight in Afghanistan. And same with Vietnam, very mountainous region. Same with even, like, I guess Korea, they weren't guerrilla forces, but still, it seems like mountains are like one of the main things that you can use, because it's like the the big things that like a traditional military has against a guerrilla force are like tanks, artillery, big heavy things like that. And that type of stuff is very hard to move up in the mountains. I'm sure that's why we used so many Humvees in Afghanistan, and also maneuver warfare. Obviously, it's harder to maneuver with tanks, but and some people, whatever. Mountains seem to be one of the big things. So that's where they stayed at for the most part, and they didn't fight in the cities a whole ton until they gained a fuck ton of power up in the mountains and the woods and stuff like that. So that's another like key thing you got to remember. Don't meet these fuckers on even ground, because you will be destroyed. You look at, and even if they meet you where you are, you're probably going to get fucked up a fair bit. This is no longer the age of the warrior that has passed. This is the age of the soldier. Well trained, well disciplined, can work together. That's why Rome was so successful. Rome didn't have, fighters that were like insanely skilled or brutal or powerful or physically powerful or anything. They weren't that much better armored. They were just insanely well disciplined, and you know, they didn't like panic under pressure and stuff like that. People used to say Roman training is just war without the blood. So this is the age of the soldier, and so don't try to go where soldiers are comfortable. Take them out of their element, make them uncomfortable, and that's what Castro and a lot of these other guys did. And I think Che, he was also the leader of one of these military groups. So didn't fight him in the city a whole ton is the main thing you got to take away from that. And so these guys are hiding out in the mountains, and they're not really coming down that much, just because it doesn't benefit them in any way, right? And it's like, I can just live in the mountains. I can live in the mountains for years and years and years, right? But and just kind of like wait you out a little bit. So some aspects of guerrilla warfare are kind of similar to attrition war, where it's just like, I'm just going to wait you out in the mountains. You're going to send a patrol up here. I'm going to pick off 4 of them, and then we're going to run away. And you're just going to be like, okay, well, I lost 4 guys, whatever. And then you're going to send another patrol, and I'm going to pick off 4 of them and run away. That's, you wear them down slowly over time, which is very dissimilar to maneuver warfare. So obviously, these guys are hiding up in the mountains. So Batista attempted a major offensive into the mountains, but the rebels used ambushes in terrain to win key battles. And there's not a whole ton of battles in guerrilla warfare that rebels win. I don't think any of these were like actual, forces just facing off against each other and like shooting and maneuvering and stuff like that. I'm sure most of these, battles were just kind of fighting that took place in the same place, in a short period of time, which does sound like a battle, but it's probably not traditionally what you think of when you think of a battle. Like, you think of 2 just big forces going at each other and clashing. This isn't this probably wasn't that. Maybe it was, but I very much doubt that, because if it was, obviously the trained soldiers would have won. And guerrilla forces are usually pretty well trained, and I think that's the main thing that a lot of people miss, especially Americans, when it comes to guerrilla warfare. Is we think it's just like farmers picking up rifles and going out to fight. No, these a lot of these forces are decently trained. Obviously not as good as a professional military force, but decently well trained and decently well funded and armed. So, but you're still not winning, a one-on-one battle against these forces. So, and obviously the terrain, this is kind of the aspect of maneuver warfare. You can just outmaneuver them. You know the terrain so much better than them. You're not going to get lost. You know how to pace yourself when you're going up a ridge line or whatever. All that shit that comes into play in these instances. So, and obviously forces have, especially the US military has kind of gotten to know that over time. And so they've gotten better at it, but still, there's a difference between like training in the mountains and living in the mountains. There's a very big difference there. And obviously these guys lived in the mountains, so they knew what the fuck was going on, and they fucked them up, hit a lot of ambushes and stuff like that. So that happened, and in December 1958, rebel columns advanced westward, capturing towns and cutting supply lines. So, and I don't think they had to I'm sure by capturing towns, they just went in, shot a few soldiers, the soldiers ran away, and they didn't really have to do anything after that, because obviously these people were having their towns occupied by, a dictator's soldiers. So they probably welcomed Che and all those guys in with open arms. And cutting supply lines too. That's another big thing that a lot of these conventional forces have over non-conventional forces, guerrilla forces. The One of the big things they have is just logistics, man. They can get, it's the US military can get a Burger King to any location in the world within 48 hours or whatever, right? They're so logistically sound. They can just keep getting supplies and ammo and men and food and water and all that stuff up to the front lines, whereas a guerrilla force, they kind of have to go through these underground uh means of transporting goods, not literally underground, but clandestine operations to get food and supplies and all that stuff. And obviously these aren't, trained members of the military. These are just dudes with a fucking donkey and a wheelbarrow, right? that's how guys like Castro were getting their shit. So that's a big thing. Mitigate their strengths. One of their strengths is logistics. They're just simply going to have better logistics just by their very nature. So that was a very good, smart thing that Castro did. So, and then on January 8th, 1955, after Batista fled Cuba, Fidel Castro entered Havana and claimed victory. And I guess Havana is also the capital of Cuba. I knew it was their biggest city, but I didn't know it was their capital. But he pulled up on there and he's like, I won. And everyone was like, fuck yeah, let's go. We're free, Fidel. And Fidel was like, you're not free. More like under new management. Huh. Okay, that was very corny. That was one of the most corny things I've ever done, but it's true. They were like, we're free. We're not going to have a dictator who doesn't hold elections anymore. And Che was like, you might still have that. You might still have a dictator who doesn't hold elections anymore and doesn't let anyone enter or leave. You might have a little bit of that. You might have a little bit of that. And that was a pretty smart thing by Fidel to prevent a guerrilla uprising. Not letting anyone enter or leave. You're cutting off external supply lines to potential guerrilla forces. So, over the course of the revolution, the guerrillas received little to no foreign aid, almost none. And this is one of the earliest incidences of guerrilla, or not guerrilla, of communist-backed insurgencies kind of in the world, right? Latin America, they had a whole lot of stuff like that. Basically all over South America, they had communist insurgencies that were backed by, I think the USSR was the main backer of communist insurgencies in Latin America, and then China and the USSR kind of combined were the main forces that backed communist insurgencies in Africa, and then obviously Asia, specifically Southeast Asia, all of those were backed by China, except for the one we're about to talk about. Um, which shit. Sorry, I had another potential roommate incident there for a second, which that is funny. It's like what fucking facade am I trying to keep up? Who gives a shit? But I was talking about uh Chinese versus USSR backed insurgencies throughout the world. The second incident that we're going to talk about, we're not talking about another communist insurgency. We're actually talking about an anti-communist insurgency against a government that was backed by the USSR. Uh, but it was in like Asia, not the Asia that you're thinking of. There, yes, the continent of Asia, but not, small eyes and bowl cuts and stuff like that. This is a little bit more uh Middle East. That's what we're talking about here. So I'll just get into it. So the second force that we're going to talk about here is the Afghan Mujahideen. So in December 1979, the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan to prop up the pro-communist government. So yeah, I never knew that Afghanistan was communist. But I guess I always thought, I knew about the Soviet-Afghan War, but I always thought that it was the Soviets invading Afghanistan to kind of make it a part of the USSR, which I'm sure that was part of their intent. I'm sure like that idea crossed their mind, if we keep continuing to support this pro-communist government, then we're eventually just gonna kind of like move in and take it over and absorb it into the USSR. But that wasn't what they were doing, or that's not what they claimed they were there for. They claimed they were there just to like back the current government, which yeah, unpopular move. Unpopular once again. This kind of goes back to the whole Cristero War thing, which there was a little bit of socialism, communism involved in that, where it's like, why are you trying to take away, in this instance, Islam away from Afghanis? You're not gonna they're never gonna go for that. They're not, you can't take away cheese from Americans. You're just not gonna convince us to give up cheese. All right? You can't take Catholicism away from Mexicans and you can't take Islam away from Afghanis, you know? Uh, which is it's not exactly what they were trying to do, but still one of the kind of core tenets of communism and socialism and just these big government ideologies as a whole is you kind of have to take away people's religion because most people are going to hold their God and their religion and their beliefs over the beliefs and, the opinions of the socialist or communist or whatever fascist government, right? So a lot of them are interested in taking away those religious beliefs, when in reality, a better idea is to kind of like work with it, which is kind of what the Mujahideen did, although they weren't trying to install communism, but they could have. So yeah, Soviets invaded in 1979, and this is a pretty interesting war. Maybe I'll do an episode about it. I love, these kind of weird wars, Cold War especially. I love the Cold War, but we're going to talk about it a little bit here. So there we go. Immediately, Afghanistan resistance groups began to organize. You want to guess where they organized? What type of terrain do you think these guys organized on? You know what I mean? Do you think they were chilling in a cornfield somewhere? Or I guess it's Afghanistan, so it would be an opium field. But where do you think these guys organized their forces? Knowing what we now know about guerrilla forces. They were in the mountains, okay? It was a Jewish doctor. I'm not gonna say uh it was a Jewish doctor and they they organized in the mountains of Afghanistan. And like I said, that was the main obstacle for US forces in Afghanistan. One of the main obstacles in Vietnam, Vietnam, a lot of these, not a lot, but the jungly regions of Southeast Asia, a lot of them have a ton of mountains there as well. So these forces, where they're very effective, is in the mountains. It mitigates so many of the advantages that it kind of even mitigates in some ways like air superiority, right? Because it's like they can still drop bombs and stuff like that from a high altitude, but if you want to go in with like a helicopter or some shit, mountains aren't just like it's not just like a high plateau or whatever. You got valleys and ridges and all that stuff. So it's probably pretty hard to like fly a helicopter and shit through there. So you're kind of mitigating a lot of the advantages. You're mitigating the logistic advantages they have over you, and you just you're kind of stopping them. And so I guess that's why mountains are so good. So I don't know. I guess if the Civil War does break out, I'm going to the fucking Appalachians, baby. Mountains. Mountains are where it's at. That's kind of the main thing I'm learning from all this. It's like the one thing you can control. You can't control whether or not the populace completely supports you. You can't control whether or not you're going to get foreign aid, but you can control where you're fighting at a little bit. So head over to the mountains, baby. The Rockies. Fucking climb up El Cap or whatever and just chill there. I guess that's the answer. So they were chilling in the mountains, kind of resisting these Soviet forces, and immediately they knew what was up, right? This is 1979. This is well after the Soviet Union had formed, and they knew they weren't getting that religion, or they weren't getting the type of religion they wanted. The government wouldn't allow it. The government wouldn't allow them to, do the call to prayer and all that shit that they do, which I kind of agree with them on that. It is very annoying. It's like, dude, I don't need someone to tell me I have a watch, right? Like that's the funny thing about the call to prayer is like there's no need for that anymore. Yeah, back in the day when like we didn't have watches or anything, there was no need for the call to prayer. There was a need for the call to prayer. There was a need for, whoever had a watch or a sundial or whatever to be like, all right, it's time. Get on the fucking loudspeakers and go, I want my all right? There used to be a need for that. No need for that anymore. Look at the fucking Garmin smartwatch, face towards Mecca, and put your head on the ground. And I did hear this comparison recently between church bells and the call to prayer, and it's like, no, a church bell rings like 3 times every hour on the hour, right? That's it's not the same as some dude getting on the loudspeaker and just going, "Mo, oh, my, so those are not it's not a good comparison. Yeah, is the church bells sometimes a little annoying? In Morris, Minnesota, where I went to school last year, we had a church that it was a Catholic church, and they banged the bells pretty loud. And I didn't have AC in my room, so I had to sleep with the window open. So sometimes it woke me up a little bit early. So was that sometimes a little bit annoying? Yeah, it was, but it's not some dude getting on a loudspeaker and and all that shit. So yeah, it's more annoying. It's fine to say that. It's not You're not an anti-Islamic to be like, I find the call to prayer to be annoying. I don't know. Or maybe you are. Maybe you are. So anyway, from 1975 or 1979 to 1981, the Mujahideen launched effective but ultimately meaningless ambushes against the Soviets. They were launching all these ambushes and all that stuff. I'm sure. God, I keep thinking my roommate's here. He's not gonna come back. But I don't know why this guy's fucking leaving and coming back so much. But whatever. Uh, yeah. So they launched all these ambushes, but they kind of didn't do anything. You know what I mean? The Soviets were highly mechanized, a very large pool of soldiers that they could draw from, all that stuff. All right. I'm just gonna try to run through this as quickly as possible. So the Mujahideen didn't have the same firepower that the Soviets had, so they couldn't really fight super effectively against them. So during this time, the Mujahideen were poorly trained and armed and lacked heavy firepower. So obviously the Soviets, they had a fuck ton of tanks. They had so many goddamn tanks. So they could just kind of roll up with that, even if they were, moving super slowly because they were in the mountains. There was nothing the Mujahideen could have done to stop them, right? Because they just didn't have the firepower to destroy these tanks. And, whatever other heavy military equipment the Soviets had in Afghanistan at the time, right? Most of the weapons they had were World War II or pre-World War II era. Very old, very shitty guns. And whatever. it, the Taliban did have a lot of those shitty guns, but they were also pretty well armed when we fought them uh, from 2001 until 2021 for some reason. I don't know why we did it, but we did. And then in 1981, the Mujahideen began receiving massive support from Pakistan's ISI, which I think is their, CIA or FBI or NSA or whatever, and then also from the CIA as well. So, and the CIA had been giving them support since 1979, but it really ramped up in 1981. They really started helping them out a whole bunch. Who was president at the time? Who was president in 1970? I think Reagan, because Carter, it might have been Carter for a little bit, and then it was Reagan, but obviously the CIA operates outside of the president's like sphere of influence. So they were just kind of doing their own thing, and they always have. They always have done their own thing, and at this time they were given weapons to the Mujahideen and all that good stuff. So, as a part of Operation Cyclone, the CIA funneled money, training, and weapons through Saudi Arabia to Afghanistan. Um, yeah, Saudi Arabia, which I don't know exactly how that works. My guess as to how it works is Saudi Arabia was just kind of a simple proxy, right? Where it's like, I can't give money directly to the Mujahideen, but I can give it to Saudi Arabia, and then Saudi Arabia can choose to do what they want with it. So I'm sure that's kind of the loophole that they use to funnel stuff to the Mujahideen in Afghanistan. So it was also during this time that the Mujahideen began using refugee camps in Pakistan as recruitment and training hubs, which this is a very smart move by the Mujahideen as a guerrilla force. It's these people in these refugee camps are obviously very mad and very upset that the Soviet Union kicked them out of their houses and all that stuff, or they had to flee due to fear of religious persecution or whatever it was that motivated them to become refugees. It was obviously because of the Soviet government. So this is a very good idea by the Mujahideen to go to these refugee camps. It's like the Soviet Union did the work for them to like create these centers where you could very easily recruit people. So a very smart move by the Mujahideen and a very stupid move by the Soviet Union. They should have worked to isolate the refugees, if that makes sense. Put them in a part of Pakistan very far away from Afghanistan. So they were, and I guess they were training there as well. I guess they cleared out. They were going to the basketball court or the recreation center or whatever, and they were practicing military drills in these refugee camps in Pakistan. So in 1986, the U.S. began supplying FIM 92 Stinger missiles, which were used to mitigate Soviet air superiority. So the Soviets, if I had to guess, probably had their air superiority kind of mitigated by the mountains, but then even more mitigated by the fact that in these Stinger missiles, they're not like, you don't need like a big truck or like a base to shoot these missiles from. These are like Javelin, like you can basically a bazooka, but it's very good at shooting down helicopters and planes and stuff like that. So that was like, that turned the tide of the war, really. The thing that was probably forcing the Mujahideen to hide in the mountains and kind of use that as their base and basically secluded them to the mountains probably was that Air Force, because I don't know. I don't have an explanation for it, but this is the thing that changed the tide of the war. I think the Air Force was the thing keeping them in the mountains, and when they got these Stinger missiles, they were kind of able to come out of the mountains and take over the country. So, in 1989, Soviet forces withdrew from Afghanistan, and the Mujahideen focused their efforts on the still communist Afghan government. And in 1992, the Mujahideen captured Kabul, and the Taliban began to rise to power. So the Taliban, their like official rise to power was 1994 to 1996, but they basically began. And the Mujahideen, one of the things that made them like so radically different from the communist forces, obviously their ideologies are different, but like the actual way they fought the war and like the people who fought the war is the Mujahideen was a lot more splintered, you know. It was all these different groups coming together, and that's how you get things like Taliban and the Taliban and Al Qaeda and stuff like that. And I think Al Qaeda is like a splinter cell of the Taliban. So it's like it was very divided, whereas the communist forces, they might have been divided in terms of like leadership and logistical support and stuff like that, but they were still united underneath the banner of communism, which is why once their fight or revolution ended, they were able to create a more cohesive, singular government, you know, even though they weren't necessarily super united during the fight itself. And that's why Afghanistan kind of fell into ruin a little bit. Also, obviously, CIA involvement didn't help with that at all. All right, so what made these forces effective? Uh, so both the Mujahideen and the communist Cubans used their ties to rural communities to hide from the government. And obviously they weren't just hiding from the government in these rural communities, they were also using them to, you know, funnel weapons and, you know, people and shit like that to themselves. So the Mujahideen used traditional ties, whereas the communists created ties by providing food, education, medicine, and the redistribution of land. And obviously a big thing, not obviously, but a big thing that was going on in Cuba was super oppressive landlords, right? Same with China, and I'm sure Russia too, you know, on some level, had very oppressive landlords. So, in one of the reasons Mao Zedong's, you know, revolution in China, even though it wasn't really a revolution, China, it was more of a unification as opposed to like a revolution. It was a cultural revolution, but not a governmental one, if that makes sense, in China, not in Cuba. In Cuba, it was kind of both a cultural and governmental revolution. But not really that cultural because everyone fucking hated Fidel Castro and communism. Talk to any Cuban from Cuba, they all despise communism. So was it that much of a cultural revolution? But both of those, and a lot of communist, you know, insurgencies and revolutions as a whole have oppressive landowners and landlords in common, you know, and just like the general hatred of those people. And that's kind of something we got going on now, you know, a lot is very shitty landlords. But I think the main difference here is I think a lot of these landlords were more so like literal lords of the land that they ruled. Maybe not like nobility or aristocracy or royalty or whatever, but they lorded over the people who lived on that land, right? People who like were farmers and stuff like that. So they essentially had serfs or peasants or slaves. These people were true peasants. They weren't just, we use the term peasant now and we think of just poor people. A real peasant is like, motherfucker, I own you, right? Like that's what a peasant is, for all intents and purposes, a slave, you know? So, which explains why the communism was so popular and why it just took such a strong grasp on these people is you think of oppressive landlords, and the landlords in America are still very shitty, awful people, but they're not like these landlords. You know, you're not being forced to pick turnips all day, or this guy's gonna like kill you or like take your family away from you or whatever. It's not shit like that, which was more so what was going on here. You know, these were true peasants, like I said. So, again, the Mujahideen used traditional thoughts to create propaganda regarding the persecution of culture in Islam as well as the importance of jihad and martyrdom. And martyrdom is a little bit different from jihad. Jihad is you just dying for the cause, whereas martyrdom is you being peacefully killed for the cause, if that makes sense. I think that's the difference between the two. So jihad is just like a martyr would be, you know, you're imprisoned and you refuse to renounce your faith and then you get put to death. That's a martyr. Whereas jihad is like I will fight and die for my faith, right? Jihad ultimately is about sacrificing yourself for Islam. And I'm sure some sects of Islam have maybe a little bit different definition of it, where it's like maybe you're not necessarily sacrificing yourself for Islam, but for the greater good. But it is Man, I don't know. I don't know if that's necessarily true, but it is basically, it's just religious motivation is what it is. And the preservation of culture as well. Obviously communism, they just want to eliminate, and like I said, any other big government policy. I'm not just shitting on communism here. Fascism, they would like to do this as well, is just kind of eliminate every other tie that you have to, like, your community and your traditional way of life and all that stuff. And that's, yeah, that's not like exclusive to communism and fascism. I would say there's a lot of stuff like that going on in, these Western liberal democracies and stuff like that. But it is one of their main goals. And so obviously you're not going to convince Afghanis not to be fucking Muslim. So the Mujahideen were able to get a fuck ton of these guys on their side. So yeah, and they stress the importance of jihad, and this is where you get into that whole thing of like the of like radical Islam, right? Of like twisting the words of the Quran to, kind of use it to your advantage. But I don't know. I don't know the exact, Quranic definition of jihad, but I don't imagine they had to twist it that much. uh, yeah, I I've read a little bit of the Quran. They get the boys are wild. You know what I mean? That reading the Quran will reveal to you why fucking, these groups shoot AKs in the air as a celebration. It's the boys like having a bit of fun. The boys are up to some fun. And like I said, the boys have been up to fun like that forever. So I'm not too pissed off at this. And then we're going to talk about how the Cubans, how their propaganda was structured at like the actual like I guess how it was structured, right? Because they both used leaflets and pamphlets and stuff a lot like that, but the Cubans did use a lot more, quote unquote new media sources. The new media being like, what the fuck is someone knocking? All right, third interruption this episode, but I think my roommate dropped something in the shower and it sounded exactly like someone knocking at the door. It sounded like the ghost of Christmas past was showing up. So, all right. Let's finish this off. So, new media used by the Cubans was in 1957, Castro had an interview with the New York Times and used it to convince the world that the revolution was still going strong. So, obviously, kind of the whole world, maybe they weren't ideologically against Batista, but they were like, Batista's not going to win this. You know, Castro just said in this very large newspaper that they're going to win the war. So, and then the Cubans used this and an underground radio station to spread their ideology uh, throughout Cuba. And then both forces used guerrilla warfare effectively and avoided fighting in the open when they could. All right. That's the end of this episode. I'm not even going to try to record any more than this. The 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 current events went well. This one not so much. I've noticed that. At least for the two recording sessions I've done in here, is the regular episodes don't go well, but or don't go smoothly. None of the episodes go well. They're all awful, but they don't go smoothly. But the fucking the the current events ones go well, or smoothly at least, no interruptions. So that's all I've got for this episode, guys. I hope you have a good day, a good week, a good year, a good life. Remember, fight in the mountains and don't go out in the open. Ping.